Okay, we're live. Welcome, everybody. Nice to have you back. We're just a few days before the vote, and always glad to talk about Turkish politics. Let's see, so all systems go. People are logging on. Just give them one more second. Yeah. Okay, so welcome everyone to our second round pre-election Q&A. Today we're speaking with Berk Esen. He's assistant professor of political science at Istanbul's Sabanci University. I'm Diego Cupolo. I'm a managing editor of Turkey Recap. Turkey Recap is a news platform. It's most commonly known as a newsletter. And we're completely run by journalists. And I have to make it clear, we're not supported by any institutions or political parties. We're completely funded by Patreon, Substack, and Merch. So this is a question and answer. You're welcome to send your questions on Turkish elections, and we'll try to get to them. We're going to try to keep this at about 1 hour in total. And to send your questions, you can use the YouTube chat or DM me or Turkey Recap on Twitter. So a brief background on where we are. There's elections on Sunday, and we did the first round on May 14th. Despite what many polls suggested, opposition candidate Kılıçdaroğlu did not prevail, and the opposition did not take the parliament as projected. Instead, Erdogan received 49.5% of the vote. Kılıçdaroğlu got about 45%, and the AKP-MHP ruling alliance took the majority in parliament. Again, this was all unexpected according to the polls. Since then, we've been talking a lot about nationalist voters. Nationalist voters have taken a lot of airspace, let's say, in Turkey. And we just published a report on this in Turkey Recap. It's in your inboxes if you haven't checked. Ahead of the runoffs on Sunday, the third place candidate for the presidential election, Sinan, he endorsed Erdogan. And Umut Özdağ, a former ally of Sinan, endorsed Kılıçdaroğlu. So we have nationalists kind of splitting the ranks and supporting opposing sides right now ahead of the Sunday vote. At the same time, Erdogan and Kılıçdaroğlu are trying to get that nationalist vote, and they're upping their campaigns with more hardline anti-refugee, anti-terrorism slogans. And this could potentially turn off some liberal or minority voters in the process. So there's a lot going on. The elections are massively important. And I'm going to turn to Berk now, who during our last chat, I distinctly remember we noted how Syrian refugees were not a central factor in pre-campaign rhetoric, pre-first round rhetoric. So now we're talking about deporting refugees all the time. Seems like the second round is the anti-refugee round. What happened in between? And what do you make of Kılıçdaroğlu's chances at the ballot box?
Well, first of all, good evening, everyone. I'm really happy to be back. Now, considering the first round results, I think it's quite clear that Kılıçdaroğlu's chances are quite slim. He got 45%, which is, of course, more than what the previous two, what the opposition candidates got in the two previous presidential elections, 2014, 2018. So Kılıçdaroğlu certainly raised the bar a bit higher. Of course, he was the joint candidate being supported by numerous political parties, but still, at the end of the day, I think opposition got a respectable amount of votes. But the problem is, basically, Tayyip Erdogan came very close to securing 50% majority. He got, I think, 49.2, almost there. And considering the fact that he also has an advantage in the abroad vote, and that the only other candidate, Sinan, has endorsed Tayyip Erdogan and is probably receiving support from Turkish ultranationalists who don't necessarily have a positive disposition towards Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. And already with the incumbency advantages and the authoritarian nature of the current regime, it's going to be very, very difficult for Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu to overtake Tayyip Erdogan. So I'm not necessarily saying that he stands no chance. I think there is still a possibility, but I see it to be not very likely. And I think the only scenario where Kılıçdaroğlu may have an advantage is, and I think we're going to discuss this, Ümit Özdağ this morning decided to endorse Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, and I think that is going to bring him some new votes, a couple of percentage points here and there. If Kılıçdaroğlu can maintain his strong majority in the Kurdish populated southeastern provinces, and if some Erdogan voters decide not to cast their ballots in the second round because because they're traveling or that they're supporting other parties within the ruling alliance, such as Yeniden Refah Partisi or MHP, and they basically say that, well, Erdogan has already won this election, and let me just sit this out. Then there might have been a chance, but I'm not so sure if Kılıçdaroğlu will be able to maintain such high support levels in the Kurdish populated southeastern provinces after Ümit Özdağ's support. I think that is going to generate some kind of a reaction there in that region. And Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu has adopted such a polarizing sort of discourse against Erdogan in order to, I think, consolidate his base, that at the same time he's consolidating the Erdogan base as well. So we're probably going to see high turnout again being delivered. Maybe not 87%, but something along the same lines, 85%, 84, 85%. But that, the lower turnout is not necessarily going to benefit the opposition. So his chances of winning this is slim. Of course, compared to the first round campaign, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu seems to have adopted a completely different discourse. He's trying to reach out to Sinan voters, many of whom are, of course, nationalist protest voters. And rather than adopting an anti-Kurdish discourse in order to reach out to these nationalist voters, I think Kılıçdaroğlu is picking the second most important issue for them, which is the opposition to the Syrian migrants. But I think has sort of went overboard with his discourse and creating a lot of generating a lot of question marks within the opposition camp, providing some unreliable figures. I don't think that there are 10 million refugees in the country. That seems to be a completely made up figure. And I don't think that he has a comprehensive agenda to push out so many Syrian migrants back to Syria. But I think he's trying to reach out to this small constituency in order to basically increase his vote share from 45% to 50%. It'll probably be not enough, but at least with this strategy, he's trying to keep the turnout rate high so that he would at least get 47, 48% of the vote share, and that it's not going to be a landslide victory for President Erdogan.
Yeah. And so on the issue of refugees, I mean, if you're saying there's 10 million refugees, aren't you setting the bar too high? How are they going to ever reach their goal if they're dealing with unrealistic numbers here? It's a rhetorical question, but do you have anything else to say on basically just this change? Go ahead.
No, I mean, they won't really be able to deliver on this point. And I think this has been Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's problem all along. I mean, clearly Turkish voters think that Syrian migrants need to go back to their country. And considering the fact that Turkey has become the country hosting the highest number of refugees in the world, that should not necessarily been very surprising. I think politically it's completely normal that many voters would feel this way. I think what is really problematic is that the main opposition, CHP, and under Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's leadership, has not necessarily put together a comprehensive, realistic plan to deal with the migration problem. I don't think that saying that you're basically kick out the entire Syrian community living in Turkey and send them back to Syria. I don't think that that's a feasible plan. I don't think that it's a realistic plan, and I don't think that politically it's a viable plan. So rather than going overboard with such a message, I think CHP should have come up with a comprehensive agenda that basically promises to, yes, return some Syrians back to Syria, as a result of negotiations with the Assad government. Also, starting off a new round of negotiations with the EU, and also mention the possibility of integration for some of the Syrians living in Turkey, and basically work together with migration experts to put together such an agenda. But that was not done, and it seems that Kılıçdaroğlu is really in free fall and is basically oscillating from one extreme to another extreme position.
Yeah. It's definitely an extreme position considering the inclusive love heart emoji rhetoric that we saw before. So I have a few questions personally before getting into the reader questions. But do you think this messaging from Kılıçdaroğlu can be seen as sincere by voters? Because it's such a U-turn compared to 2 weeks ago, inclusiveness versus complete nationalism. So is it sincere? And, did he have a choice? Was there an alternative route that he could have taken? And don't speculate too much on, things that can't happen anymore, but is Turkish nationalism just the fallback position for electoral politics?
I don't think that it's really a credible message, not only because it's diametrically opposed to what Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu was saying during the first round of the campaign. Yes, he did tell voters that he's going to return Syrians back home, but I think the emphasis was on the voluntary nature of this, that supposedly Syrians were to be given some incentives over time, but and of course no number was really shared. And during the second round campaign, we see a completely different Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. When you have a candidate who's been running a mainstream party for 13 years, I think most of the voters have already made up their minds on Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, one way or another, positive or negative. And so such a U-turn, I think, is not going to really come across as credible. And I think the other reason why this message is not really going to be very credible is because given the setup of the opposition alliance, other than Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the leaders of the 5 opposition parties that are now part of the nation's alliance will become vice presidents, and one of these politicians is of course Ahmet Davutoğlu, the leader of the Future Party. He also happens to be the country's former foreign minister and former prime minister, under whose watch Turkey followed an open door policy, and millions of Syrians have moved into Turkey while he was running the Turkish government. So you can't really, I think, convince the voters that you will be able to adopt such a drastic measure while also retaining Ahmet Davutoğlu in your team and appointing him as vice president. So I think most voters will probably see it as a rhetorical change in order to win votes. Now, for some nationalist voters who cast their ballots for Sinan, they might be opposed to Tayyip Erdogan all along and will probably support Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, not necessarily because Kılıçdaroğlu changed his discourse dramatically, but because all along they've been opposed to Tayyip Erdogan's migration policy, and now they have the chance to, in the second round, to decide between Kılıçdaroğlu and Erdogan, and they might basically throw their support behind Kılıçdaroğlu. But otherwise, I don't find this message to be very credible. But of course, many of the things that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu said during the campaign has also not been credible. I mean, do I really believe that under Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's presidency, 300 billion euros worth of investment is going to come from London to Turkey? No. So I think many of these numbers are just made up, not necessarily part of comprehensive plans. I wouldn't necessarily wholeheartedly support or get excessively worried about anything that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu says on the campaign trail.
Yeah. So looking at the questions, first one, the opposition increased its voter share. CHP never had or hasn't had this high performance in decades. Is that accurate? So if the CHP increased its voter share, why are so many opposition supporters demoralized right now? Why aren't they seeming more active. What's your understanding of the lack of morale after the first round vote?
Well, the CHP didn't increase its vote share in the parliamentary elections. I think CHP got around 25.2%, which is lower than what Kılıçdaroğlu CHP got in the 2011 parliamentary elections. It's slightly better than the party's performance in 2018 parliamentary elections, but it's not really a huge jump. I think Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu outperformed Ekmelettin İhsanoğlu in 2014, and of course his party's candidate Muharrem İnce in 2018 presidential elections. But even that is not very surprising, because Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu was really the joint candidate, being supported by CHP, İYİ Party, all these other minor right-wing parties, as well as the pro-Kurdish alliance. Particularly, of course, HDP. I think the reason why so many opposition voters are demoralized, I can think of several reasons. Well, first of all, of course, 45% is a respectable level of support. But the problem is, despite the ongoing economic crisis and the negligence of the government during and after the earthquake, Erdogan still got nearly 50%. It's just really, really, I think, disappointing for the opposition voters that Erdogan can still command such huge popularity in the eyes of the voters. I think that is probably the most important reason. But I think it's also the case that both the opposition leaders, but also the polling agencies, had raised the expectations of the opposition voters excessively. Many polling agencies showed Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu winning this election in the first round, not even leaving it to the second round. And even those polling companies that showed election advancing to a second round, I think in every single one of them, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu was up ahead, in front of Tayyip Erdogan by several points in some of these polls. And, looking at the statements of the opposition leaders, particularly the CHP leadership, I think they were overconfident that they were going to win this election in the first round. So they raised the expectations excessively. I think as part of a political strategy, they really tried to finish this in one round, because, looking at all these discussions that we have around Ümit Özdağ and Sinan, you can figure out why. With the third candidate being an ultra-nationalist politician, I think it wasn't really clear what Kılıçdaroğlu could get out of them. And so the entire strategy was based on defeating Erdogan in one round, because the parliamentary elections, it was clear that the ruling alliance would outperform the nation's alliance, and that it would create an advantage to Erdogan. But of course, this wasn't, it turns out, a very realistic scenario. I think had Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu sort of not increased the expectations and tried to focus on preventing Erdogan from winning the election in the first round and then mobilizing the anti-Erdogan vote in the second round, I think he would have higher chances. What could he have done alternatively during this second round campaign, a bit different from his current course, is, of course, I think he should have announced some kind of a cabinet. Maybe not necessarily ministerial positions for the entire cabinet, but of course, especially for some important political posts. Minister of Interior, Minister of Economics, maybe announcing an economics team, announcing a set of ministers, particularly from CHP and İYİ Party, so that both parties would feel that they are vested in winning in this election, and that the sort of policies that the new government would follow under Kılıçdaroğlu's watch would become clear. Right now, there are, for instance, rumors of Ümit Özdağ becoming Minister of Interior. Probably that is not going to happen. But since Kılıçdaroğlu hasn't announced the Minister of Interior, we cannot rule out that possibility that a very far-right politician under Kılıçdaroğlu's watch has the chance to become Minister of Interior. Had Kılıçdaroğlu announced his, and announced these positions, I think it would have been a different story. I think they should have focused on, rather than using fear tactics, I think they should have made a case to the voters that the economic management, the management of the Turkish economy would be terrible under Erdogan's watch, and that there are already these alarming signs that are becoming apparent, and that Kılıçdaroğlu is going to put in place a strong, competent team who will address this economic crisis. I think they could have easily sort of tackled this issue from that angle. And especially after Sinan Oğan had endorsed Tayyip Erdogan, I'm not so sure if Ümit Özdağ had all the cards, because of course there's no way that Ümit Özdağ could have supported Tayyip Erdogan, and there's really no other option for him but to support Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. I think Kılıçdaroğlu could have gotten his support without really conveying an image of a weak politician, repeatedly talking to Ümit Özdağ, making concessions, which would really hurt him, I think, in the eyes of some Kurdish voters. So slightly different management of the situation, but ultimately, I think the first round results had weakened Kılıçdaroğlu's room for maneuver, and that's why he finds himself in this tight spot.
Yeah, so we have a question about the CHP leadership and his weakened position, which you just referenced. So do you think that not winning elections could lead to challenges to Kılıçdaroğlu's leadership of the CHP? And do you have any broader predictions about the table of six and what happens to that?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to be very difficult for the current opposition alliance, the so-called Nations Alliance, or the Table of Six, to remain united after the election in the event of a Kılıçdaroğlu defeat. I think, well, first of all, the leadership of these parties will start pointing fingers at one another to explain this defeat, because, people would want to account this defeat to someone, to some party, to some organization, and I think there are some possible candidates for that. And of course, Erdogan, having already attained parliamentary majority, if he wins the presidency, he will really have a strong bargaining position vis-a-vis these conservative Islamist MPs who got elected into the parliament under the banner of CHP, but will probably return back to their political parties, right? Especially Saadet Partisi, but to a certain extent, Gelecek Partisi. The Felicity and the Future Party MPs are quite conservative, and I think on many issues, their base, their voters would want them to cooperate with Erdogan. And so Erdogan could easily, get through the parliament numerous measures that will cater to a conservative constituency and can easily get the support of these parties. So I see it very difficult for this current opposition alliance to continue. I think the real question here is whether or not the CHP party cooperation would survive, because of course in 10 months time we're headed into the 2024 local elections, and in 2019 actually it was only these two parties that formed an alliance of some sort, fielded joint candidates and won so many races, so many local races in major metropolitan areas across the country, including of course Istanbul, Ankara, but also several major southern provinces like Antalya, Adana, Hatay, and so on. If this alliance is not maintained, I think it's going to be very, very difficult for these mayors to win re-election, because of course Erdogan would further curtail the democratic space available to these mayors. I think the 2024 local election campaign is going to be even more unfree and unfair. We might actually see Ekrem İmamoğlu get politically banned. The court has already decided to ban him, and we're waiting to hear from the appeal process. But of course, if Erdogan wins the presidency, probably he would have easier time confronting Ekrem İmamoğlu. What is not really discussed is that, of course, in 2018, E-Party could enter the parliament with 40-something MPs thanks to its alliance with CHP. So it benefited from this alliance. But in 2019 local elections, E-Party hasn't really benefited from the alliance. I think E-Party only won in 14 local races, in mostly small, not at the provincial centers, but at small district levels. So from this alliance, it was mainly CHP candidates that benefited in 2009. In 2024, I don't know whether E-Party would stick to CHP unless there's some changes within the CHP leadership. And that brings me to the first part of your question, what happens to Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu? My speculation is that the reason why Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu has adopted such a polarizing discourse, attacking Erdogan personally, when for years he and his colleagues had told us that polarization strategy was not working and that CHP leadership had adopted this radical love course and that they were trying to depolarize, Kılıçdaroğlu seems to have completely reversed that agenda. And I think the real reason for that is not necessarily to win this presidential election. I think the leadership knows that the chances are slim, but rather they want to mobilize and consolidate the CHP base so that even if the election is lost, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu would lose with a 47 or 48% of the vote share, which is quite high, and that Kılıçdaroğlu will try to show that as a victory to his base. Like, he's going to say, this was a very unfair campaign. The entire government-run media attacked me personally. What could I have done? Look, I at least got 48%. Let me retain my leadership position. My speculation is that he'll try to stick around for until, at the very least, until after the local elections. And of course, the National Convention of CHP is coming up. It was postponed in 2022 to this year. And then it was postponed again because this is election year. But of course, after the election, they need to have the convention. E-Party, for instance, is going to have its national convention in June, immediately after the election. And I expect some changes within E-Party leadership. Not so much Meral Akşener. I think she will survive. She'll retain her leadership post, but she will probably purge some of the prominent figures within the E-Party leadership. And then the pressure will be on CHP. I don't know, because during the campaign, it became extremely difficult within the opposition camp to criticize Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. People who questioned Kılıçdaroğlu's leadership, who criticized his discourse, who criticized his policies, have come under strong attack. And the opposition media seems to be acting in concert with the CHP leadership. So I don't know. There's a good chance that Kılıçdaroğlu may lose the presidency, but retain the leadership of CHP. And beyond that, I think it's going to be very difficult to maintain nations alliance.
Yeah. No, thanks for going into the details there. You kind of touched on the radical love rhetoric and what worked in Istanbul local elections in 2019 by having, less polarizing rhetoric in the campaign. But considering that it didn't exactly work for Kılıçdaroğlu in the first round, would you say that this is proof that the radical love rhetoric doesn't work on a national scale in Turkey? Or do you think it's more about the candidate?
I think it's somewhere in between. I don't think that the radical love message and even Kılıçdaroğlu's inclusive rhetoric during the campaign was the wrong message. I think it was the correct message, but maybe it was accompanied by a wrong strategy and certainly by a wrong candidate. I think what comes across in the Istanbul campaign during the 2019 local elections was that CHP ran a superb campaign backed up by a very strong local organization. And this local organization run by Canan Kaftancıoğlu did door-to-door canvassing. They really tried to reach out to voters on a personal level, right? Directly appealed to them, spoke to them. Ekrem İmamoğlu, of course, this being a provincial election, held small-scale rallies across the entire city, visiting every single district, visiting bazaars, talking to people on the street. Of course, you can do it in a local election race, but it's very difficult to do this in a national campaign when you only have 6 weeks. So the problem with Kılıçdaroğlu's inclusive rhetoric was that his campaign was mostly run through social media. Him basically sharing, I think, more than 30 videos from his social media accounts. And these are mostly well-crafted messages catering to his own base. I don't know how many of his videos were watched by AKP and swing voters, and I don't know how effective these videos were in reaching out to these voters. Because watching people on social media, especially in an age when the country's politics is so polarized, may not necessarily be so effective. I think Ekrem İmamoğlu's campaign in 2019 was very different in that regard. Maybe they had the same message, but they had the wrong strategy and maybe the wrong candidate, because Ekrem İmamoğlu is a much more popular politician than Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, certainly better liked. And I think for many voters, maybe not so much for opposition voters, but certainly for the other camp, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is a is a 74-year-old politician who's been around since 2010, somehow retained his position despite losing several elections in a row, and that people just stopped listening to him. I think that was the problem. But thanks to the inclusive message, Kılıçdaroğlu actually got 45%. Had he, for instance, adopted his current discourse in the first round, I don't think that he would have gotten 45% of the vote share. And that's what makes me a bit worried about the second round. I'm not necessarily saying, he's destined to lose. The anti-Erdogan sentiment in the country is actually quite high. So if Erdogan voters do not go out to vote in extremely high numbers, we may actually see Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu increase his vote share. Because I've been checking the turnout rates in AKP strongholds. And in some ballot boxes, the turnout rate has been more than 90%. And that's an extremely high figure that they may not be able to retain in the second round. And that, if the AKP turnout rate decreases from 90% to, say, 82%, that would be a huge vote loss for Erdogan. And then, if Kılıçdaroğlu can maintain his turnout rates, he may have a chance. But had he done this strategy in the first round, I don't think that he would have gotten 45%. So it's not the message, but maybe the accompanying strategy and the candidate that was a bit more different from 2019.
Yeah, and we have a question from someone named Mark about the strategy and whether you think that the CHP needed a more face-to-face approach. There's been a lot of rhetoric about whether there's grassroots support for the Nation Alliance and whether they did enough outreach. There's also disappointment based on just having the inclusive messages. Can you convince voters only with messages has been a big question I've been seeing. And did they need to do more on the ground work, door-to-door work? What's your interpretation of just the functions of campaigning and the Nation Alliance?
No, I mean, I agree. I agree with this question. I think they certainly should have adopted a more face-to-face approach. Run a campaign on a grassroots level, and maybe started the campaign. I think they needed to have started the campaign much earlier. Turkey has this electoral authoritarian regime where the playing field is uneven and is tilted against the opposition. Erdogan and his ruling alliance controls much of the national media. They control the state bureaucracy, and obviously they're going to have uneven access to public resources that would benefit the incumbent and governing the candidates from the governing parties. When you're running against such a formidable foe, under unlikely circumstances, I think you needed to have started campaigning much earlier. So the Nations Alliance should have announced its candidate much earlier and started the campaign in earnest months ago, and used this time until the official start of the campaign to build up a national level organization around this campaign, around this candidate, and pursue a more face-to-face approach. Visit people at their homes, maybe invest in the organizations of these opposition parties, right? CHP has a national level organization, but of course, especially in the conservative Anatolian provinces, this organization is not very strong. And the organization was really concentrated on sharing the spoils of power without actually attaining power, or before attaining power. Everyone was really discussing among themselves within the local organizations of CHP who will get what. And I think they lost track of the campaign. E-Party, is a party that has been around since 2017, early 2018. Yes, they have a national level organization, but of course, many of their cadres come from Turkish ultranationalist backgrounds. And I think in many parts of the country, they have weak organizations. Now, all the other opposition parties that are part of the Nations Alliance don't even have that kind of structure. So they didn't really have the capacity to pursue this grassroots campaign. And I think that was what was missing. Had they had a more popular candidate early on, started the campaign in earnest, I think they would have had easier time sort of managing this situation. Instead, they ended up with Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, started the campaign very late. The country was already shaken by the earthquake, and much of the campaign was run on social media, which I think persuaded many opposition voters that Kılıçdaroğlu was a good candidate because he was giving all these inclusive messages from his Twitter account. But for the rest of the voters, the campaign didn't really touch them. I think that was a problem.
But first we had to make the big book of joint policies before we could start the campaign, no, as the opposition. Just anecdotally, I was in Trabzon at the CHP youth branch, and it was pretty funny to just look around and see the young CHP supporters trying to campaign, because I noticed a few of them picked up that, what do you call it, memorandum, the opposition memorandum, and they would open the book for the first time and start on page 1, which told me that they hadn't looked at it. And, you know, so much effort went into that, that I just wonder what the reasoning was for the opposition to focus first on all these shared agreed points. And then, but I mean, to move forward, sorry, just to put a observation out there, to move forward, you recently wrote an article for MEI. It's called Assessing Competing Scenarios for Turkey's Parliamentary Elections. And to get into the details, you noted that the 3 main alliances didn't prepare joint candidate lists. So can you just talk a little bit about what that means and what the impact on the parliamentary race was because of this?
Yes. So the ruling alliance changed Turkey's electoral law in 2022. So that new election law went into effect a few months ago, and we had the recent elections being conducted under this new system. And the new system actually gives an advantage to those parties that receive more votes, and so it really looked as if it was in the best interest of the minor parties to run under the party list of the big party, so that they could get more MPs. And that's why there was actually a push within these alliances to create a joint list. But interestingly, none of the 3 main alliances ended up preparing comprehensive joint candidate lists. They did, for instance, the third, the leftist pro-Kurdish alliance ended up producing a joint candidate list with Yeşil Sol Party, the Green Left Party, being supported by all these minor left-wing parties, but Turkish Workers' Party ran separately. The same thing happened within the opposition alliance. All these 4 minor right-wing parties run under the party banner of CHP, but E Party did not join the joint list. And to the surprise of many, the ruling alliance actually just let every party run separately, but of course under the alliance structure. Now, what is interesting is that the strategy of the ruling alliance seems to have succeeded more than the strategy followed by the opposition parties. I think the reason for that is AKP and MHP, actually their strongholds are more or less in the same provinces. Right? Both parties actually get sizable vote shares in conservative Anatolian provinces, in central Anatolia, in the Black Sea region, and in eastern Anatolia. And so even though AKP and MHP run separate candidates in these provinces, they didn't necessarily lose many seats. I think they didn't even lose any seats because of the fact that usually AKP was the first in those provinces and MHP was the second. So they ended up sharing the MPs among themselves. Maybe in developed Western provinces, by entering the election separately, MHP ended up costing AKP a few seats here and there. But because the 2 opposition alliances run under separate lists, they couldn't really benefit from that. My sense is that Erdogan's strategy was to cast the net widely because he knew that there was a lot of discontent among AKP voters towards the AKP leadership. I think many AKP voters were disillusioned by the corruption within AKP, by the rise of bad candidates within the AKP organization, and they wanted to punish the AKP. By casting the net widely, by basically telling voters that if they were telling conservative voters that if they were pissed off at AKP, you had Yeniden Refah Partisi. So the conservative Islamist voters could actually punish AKP, go for Yeniden Refah Partisi, but still vote for Erdogan. Because Erdogan was no longer just the AKP leader, but he was the leader of the entire alliance. And that he actually, because of his personal popularity and charisma, he could sort of make himself aloof from these intra-party rifts and struggles. And the same point was true for these conservative nationalists. Basically, Erdogan ended up saying, look, if you don't like AKP, you have MHP. As long as you vote for me in the presidential elections and you vote for the ruling alliance in the parliamentary elections, it doesn't matter if you don't vote for AKP. And indeed, looking at the election results, Erdogan got 49.2%, if I remember correctly, and his party got 35.5%. This never happened. The gap is now quite huge. There is almost a 15 percentage point difference between the AKP vote share and the Erdogan, but Erdogan is still winning. The minor right-wing parties in the opposition camp followed the opposite strategy and they failed. Rather than casting the net widely, they ended up all running under the banner of CHP, and I think got discredited in the eyes of conservative voters. Because conservative voters could not really bring themselves to vote for CHP, even if at the end of the day, that would benefit some conservative MP candidates from Deva, Gelecek, or Saadet. So I think Yeniden Refah Partisi shifted votes away from these minor right-wing parties and basically left the CHP vote as it probably would have been. In fact, CHP probably lost some votes to Turkish Workers' Party. So I think, in the parliamentary elections, the ruling alliance's strategy worked. They studied these, they could have done some tactical votings. Maybe here and there, MHP could have stood down and not run, especially in the Western provinces. But I don't think that it hurt them much. The opposition was more disoriented. You also have followed this. There was a huge rift between HDP and Turkish Workers' Party, which hurt both parties. We've been discussing Nations Alliance, but I think after this election, I don't know how strong this current leftist alliance would be. I don't know if that alliance would persist because there seems to be really bad blood between HDP and Turkish Workers' Party.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We also have other forward-looking questions. I think we covered the O1 endorsements, right? In the beginning. Did you want to say anything else about those? Just the recent news, the potential negative impacts of Kılıçdaroğlu being endorsed by Ozda.
Well, the HDP leadership made its an announcement just a couple of hours ago, and it seems that they are now holding intra-party consultations and negotiations, and that they're going to make an official announcement tomorrow. I don't know if they have the option to not officially endorse Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. At this point, they're really in this very impossible situation. I don't think that they have a good move. And I think ultimately they will probably stick to Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu because the other option is far worse. But my sense is that the Ümit Özdağ endorsement of Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, and more importantly, in the protocol that was announced this morning, I think the 4th article mentions the kayyum practice. Sugarcoats it, uses a very moderate discourse, but at the end of the day, the concept of kayyum is still there. I think some Kurdish voters would not be motivated to go out to vote. So I don't think that any Kurdish voters would change their voting decision and cast their ballots for Erdogan, but the turnout in the Kurdish populated provinces will go down. I think currently it's around 75 to 80%. Most likely it's going to come down 5, maybe 10 points. And that would, of course, hurt Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. Considering the fact that he's already trailing Erdogan by 5 points and needs every vote that he can muster, that is, of course, really bad news. So I think Özdağ endorsement comes with a huge cost. It would have been far better for Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu to run a joint campaign together with İYİ Party, let İYİ Party get stronger so that nationalist voters would be consolidated behind İYİ Party's banner. Had Kılıçdaroğlu announced some ministerial positions for İYİ Party, I think that would have happened. But he didn't really follow that strategy, and now he has to openly negotiate with Ümit Özdağ, a far-right politician, when he didn't want to do it with İYİ Party. That, I think, is a failed strategy. I don't know if it would cost him the election, but I think it's just bad strategy that he pursued.
Yeah, definitely. The other forward-looking questions were on Erdogan's potential cabinet, considering that he is favored to win. Do you have any predictions on who might be economy minister, interior minister, and what happens to, people like Soylu, who is now deputy and a minister at the same time? The same question applies to Kılıçdaroğlu, but I think Erdogan is favored. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Erdogan is certainly favored. Except for 2, all the cabinet ministers run for parliamentary deputy positions. And of course, if they're going to become ministers again, they will need to resign their MP positions. I don't think that Erdogan is going to appoint most of them to the cabinet. So probably most of the ministers will change. I'm sort of undecided when it comes to 2 figures. Süleyman Soylu, you already mentioned him, the current Minister of Interior, of course, very significant as a political figure, has been a hardliner politician, supported by MHP, and I think there is some bad blood between Soylu and Erdogan, but of course Soylu has really been a useful figure for Erdogan too. And also the current Minister of Defense, Hulusi Akar. I think there is a chance that, I don't know how high that is, how likely it is, but that both of them might be reappointed to their ministerial positions and then resign. Or if Erdogan can do it, I think he would try to get rid of both of these strong figures, because, of course, under this personalistic leadership that he has, he doesn't want strong ministers. So there are 2 question marks there. In terms of new figures, of course, several names are, several contenders have been in play. İbrahim Kalın, the chief presidential advisor on foreign policy matters for years. Erdogan and İbrahim Kalın worked very well for many, many years. He's a possible choice for Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I think if he's endorsed, that would be a sign to the West that Erdogan is not going to follow a very anti-Western policy, whatever that means. I think we will have a lot of quarrels between Western governments and Erdogan, but at least there would be a strong foreign minister who would be there to negotiate. So İbrahim Kalın is a possibility. Hakan Fidan, right? Could become Minister of Interior. He's been running Turkish intelligence agency, I think, since 2010. This is the longest term, longest tenure for a spy master in Turkish history. The big question, of course, when it comes to economics policy, who would be the Minister of Economics? Mehmet Şimşek. Tayyip Erdogan has been trying to persuade him for months now. Mehmet Şimşek has been non-committal. But after Erdogan wins, he might again push for Şimşek, being appointed. And if he is appointed, I think there would be, there will be a chance that Erdogan would revert back to some kind of orthodox policies. But these are big ifs. But those are the candidates. When it comes to the opposition, Kılıçdaroğlu has already announced. Kılıçdaroğlu or his colleagues had already announced a few figures. Muharrem Erkek, I think, is going to be the Minister of Justice from CHP. Ahmet Akın, is going to become the Minister of Energy. Engin Özkoç is going to become the Minister of Interior. I don't know if a deal was made with Ümit Özdağ today, but of course, Selin Sayekböke, she hasn't run for the parliamentary elections, so probably will get a ministerial position if Kılıçdaroğlu wins. The interesting point would be Bilge Yılmaz. Will Bilge Yılmaz get the chief economics position? He comes from İYİ Party. İYİ Party has really been pushing to have him being placed at the top of Turkey's economics team. Those are the likely candidates from the opposition.
Thank you so much. You're so detailed. Very good, very good. We have 10 minutes left. I'm just going to get to a few more questions. If anyone has anything else they want to ask, make sure to ask now. There's one question about what you think explains the HDP losses in votes in Kurdish majority areas in the southeast. What's going on? Why did the Yeşil Sol party lose some votes? Full disclosure, my wife is in the Yeşil Sol party now. She was elected.
Congratulations to Ceylan. I followed her campaign from Instagram and was happy to see her elected. I think we need more time to really understand what happened on the ground. My sense is that there might be some possible several reasons for this. I think part of it is, there's some allegations of electoral irregularities, especially in Kurdish populated, the countryside of Kurdish populated southeastern provinces. Turkish security forces have high visibility lately, and that they might have pushed the turnout rates to go down a bit. And indeed, in the region, turnout rates have declined. There could be that possibility, whenever there is pressure on, of course, for years, there's been pressure on the pro-Kurdish movement. Its organizational structure has been decimated with hundreds of HDP politicians being imprisoned over the years. Of course, the most well-known example would be Selahattin Demirtas, but also many other HDP former mayors, HDP former MPs. So, electoral irregularities, government pressure on HDP organization, I think, might explain at least some of the decline. It's also possible that some middle-class Kurdish voters in the region are, I don't know, maybe disillusioned by some statements coming from some PKK leaders, and that they might have wanted a moderate option. CHP seems to have increased its vote share, not by a lot, but considering how minimal the party's support was, in some provinces, CHP tripled its vote share, and maybe here and there, a couple of percentage points came from middle-class Kurdish voters who in previous elections voted for HDP, but now that the electoral barrier was lowered from 10% to 7%, they felt that they could, at least one election strategically, vote for CHP. Of course, this rift between Turkish Workers' Party and Green Left Party, or HDP, ended up, I think, hurting both parties, because when you add up the vote share of both parties, it comes very close to what HDP got last time. Of course, some of the votes that Turkish Workers' Party got is coming from left-wing CHP voters who didn't want to cast their ballots for the joint list, but some others are former HDP voters that wanted to support Turkish Workers' Party. So there might be, several factors. And at the end of the day, I think the vote loss was 2.5%, which is 25% of the electorate of the party. So it's sizable percentage-wise, like ratio-wise, but not very high percentage-wise. So some electoral irregularity and some strategic voting, I think, explains much of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we're getting some big questions on Erdogan's legacy and whether this is his last election, what you think happens to him if he wins. What do you make looking forward of Erdogan's political career if he wins? And does this mean we're going to get Kanal Istanbul built?
I don't think that we're going to have Kanal Istanbul built. Turkish economy is in tatters. I think we're about to, if Erdogan is elected, we're about to enter into a massive economic crisis. There's already been economic downturn for several years now. The earthquake, the cost of the earthquake is going to be devastating, and we haven't even started discussing that. But even conservative figures suggest that to rebuild the earthquake area, to rebuild the houses that were demolished during the earthquake, it would require more than $100 billion worth of investment. And we simply don't have that. So I'm not so sure if Erdogan would be able to undertake a massive project like Kanal Istanbul. I think we will enter into a period of political and economic uncertainty, not yet instability, because of course, if Erdogan wins, then he will have a lot of popular support and he controls a strong parliamentary majority. So I don't really expect, political instability at least in the near future, as long as Erdogan doesn't get sick, as long as Erdogan is physically intact, able to appear in front of cameras and at least give the image of governing the country. But there will be a lot of political and economic uncertainty. Economic policies may change. We may experience a return to some orthodox measures, or we may see Erdogan adopt some heterodox measures and back them up with more tightening, currency controls and so on. Interventions in some national banks. So economic uncertainty. Politically speaking, we have the local elections coming up in 10 months' time. So I think we will very soon again have election debates that would force opposition parties to get their act together again very soon. But I think opposition parties will be in disarray. So a lot of uncertainty. And I don't think that we'll be able to know what will come out of it, at least for another year. And then, I think Turkey will be at a crossroads. I'm not necessarily very pessimistic yet, but I see optimistic and very pessimistic scenarios. I think Erdogan's regime is extremely vulnerable against political and economic crises. It's just that the opposition, even if the opposition cannot unseat Erdogan this time around, I don't think that it's game over for them, unless, of course, they throw in the towel. Unless, for instance, the Nation Alliance disintegrates and Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu keeps his position and basically follows the same strategies. And then, of course, we might head towards a pessimistic scenario too.
And to wrap up, just can you give a probability on Sinan Oğan becoming the future head of MHP?
I don't think that it's more than 50%. Bahçeli is very jealous. I don't think that he would prefer Oğan to be around. Sinan Oğan has connections to the current regime in Azerbaijan. Has a lot of solidarity networks. I don't think that Turkish ultranationals would like that. So Bahçeli would probably try to give the leadership to someone else, even if he cannot retain it because he gets sick. I don't think that he will pick Sinan Oğan. I don't think that Sinan Oğan has, I don't think that Sinan Oğan is a popular figure with regards to the MHP cadres, who are all personally loyal to Devlet Bahçeli and would probably prefer to support one of his deputy chairmen. So a figure like Erdogan would need to intervene. So that's why I don't think that it's not 0%. Like it's not impossible, but I don't think that it's a very likely scenario.
Thank you so much, Berk, and thank you everybody for sending questions. I hope this was informative, and we're all waiting to see what happens Sunday. We'll be back next week to talk about it, and I hope to talk to you again, Berk, and we have many more elections to talk about in the future. So thanks again, everyone, and have a good evening or day wherever you are.
Take care. Thanks for having me, Diego.